So a big part of what we have to do is to think about how we can create content that works in a dynamic, participatory information environment. We wrote the report as a way to try and bring in more theory, more historical context, and a lot of kind of really core principles around communication. And I was really proud of the report. But what ended up getting taken from the report was this Venn diagram, where we made distinctions between misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, which was a term that we coined. But on the other hand, I think I'm disappointed that that was really the main part of the report that got taken, because I actually think that the definitional way of thinking about this problem is actually the least interesting and the least useful. I've kind of distanced myself from those definitions because I think it kind of led us down a path that I don't think was as helpful as we needed. And I think we have to be clearer around the fact that there's really no term that can help encompass all of this, and that we need to be more strict in our terminology, even from a research perspective or a benchmarking perspective. So we use the term misinformation, but there's no one agreed upon definition of what misinformation means. I have my definition, but how you operationalize it is very different. So I wish that we could have not just academic definitions, but operationalized definitions. So at my lab, we have just done a systematic review of over 50 studies that included over 120 interventions. And at the end of it, we assumed that we would say, okay, the field has agreed upon, this is what the consensus is. We can't make those conclusions because everybody was using different definitions and different stimuli and different measurements. So now we're left with this situation where there's lots and lots of conferences, there's lots of initiatives, but when I look at the field and say, what impact has all of this busyness had? I think the result is quite little, apart from if I walk down the street and I talk to people about misinformation, they'll say, oh yes, it's a big problem, right? So people have been primed to see it as a problem because we're talking about it all the time, but we haven't necessarily connected the talking with strategic, properly evaluated, scaled in a way that really is going to have the most impact. We haven't done that part of the project. And I think that's okay. We're still an early and young field, but I would argue the next decade, we have to do that. So media literacy is incredibly important, but we don't have a combined body of work that says, how do we, for example, test 5 different curricula and evaluate what really works? And so I know that there's discomfort with this idea that you have a smaller number of players, but we need a smaller number of players with adequate resources to really respond to this problem adequately. And so when we think about what the incentives are here, we really need to have independent money in large enough quantities to really tackle this very, very complex problem at the scale that we need, as opposed to what we're seeing at the moment, which isn't necessarily coordinated enough and it's not moving us in the direction that we need to go. I think when we start to look, there are examples of what can work. The problem is when this is a global problem and we're often not aware of incredible initiatives that are happening outside the US or Western Europe. And so to me, I think it's really about recognizing those, not winners, but recognizing those who have been doing this for a long time, deeply understand the problem, and really do have a roadmap to success. There's a new study out today that talks about in 2021, the content that had the most impact on people's likelihood to be vaccinated wasn't misinformation on Facebook, which was often flagged and has a warning label. It was headlines from news organizations that said things like, doctor gets vaccinated and dies 2 weeks later. A true headline, and in the whole piece was pretty responsible, but actually the headline sowed doubt around the vaccine. So as we know, we have real challenges with different types of news organizations and their role to play. offline spaces in terms of how information travels between online and offline. I think if we really did a better job of understanding community information needs, or exactly the point of why is it that people might be more vulnerable towards believing falsehoods or conspiracies, then I think we have a much better way of understanding the complexity of this problem. This is not about debunking one false claim after another. It's why do so many people believe this content, and maybe they don't even believe it, but for them it's about identity. So deciding whether or not to vaccinate your children, sometimes it's because you have read something and you've been convinced by it. For other people, it's about connecting with other mothers at the school gate who don't vaccinate their children, and it's about identity, and it's about who you vote for. So all of this is so complex, and we end up going to what we can see, which is the content, as opposed to understanding all the dynamics which help us understand why people consume this kind of content in the first place and why they share it. Media developer is even more important than it ever was, and it was always fundamentally important. But a lot of the work I think we need to do needs to be this through this frame of community information needs. So I increasingly talk about the information ecosystem, where there's about 20% of the ecosystem which is full of falsehoods and conspiracies and hate speech. But we don't do very much with the 80% of the information ecosystem that we could strengthen, that we can ensure that that 80% is doing a much better job of listening to communities, listening to their questions and concerns, and responding to those questions and concerns. I'm certainly not making any kind of, I'm not forgiving the platforms, but often the platforms are saying, we want to elevate quality information. But then when they look to different media organizations, community-based organizations, government agencies, the content is awful. It is badly designed. It is too text-based. It's not clear and simple. It's not designed for social media. And we could argue, well, why should we be creating content to make money for Mark Zuckerberg? I agree with that. But I actually think that there is a lot that can be done in our information ecosystem, those of us who are in a position to create quality information, timely and relevant information. For us, we need to get better at creating content that works in the contemporary information ecosystem. I say to many people, we still communicate like it's 1996. I think what I've learned over the last, I've been thinking about these issues since 2007, is that it's absolutely about understanding the dynamics that sit underneath this. This is absolutely a sociological problem, a psychological problem, a political economy problem. And I think I was dazzled by the hoaxes. I was dazzled by the content. And I didn't think this was a simple problem, but I thought the answer lay in what we could see. And actually, the answer lays in the parts that we can't see. And it's those dynamics that lie under societal forces that we need to be spending more time on. So I think one of my other lessons is that we, and when I say we, I mean researchers, journalists, fact checkers, we get obsessed by the individual examples. We say, should this tweet be taken down? Should this YouTube video be throttled in the algorithm? Should we flag this Facebook post? We build databases where we take examples and we save the URL, and then we tag it. Like, is this misleading? Is this conspiracy? And so that's the work that we've done, particularly over the last 6 years. But actually, I think we've missed the major problem, which is the way that these individual examples sit under these grand narratives. And if we understood things from a narrative perspective, I think we'd be in a better place in terms of how do we reframe conversations? How do we respond to the narratives rather than playing whack-a-mole with the individual posts? Because again, we've been chasing our tail, and I think we've missed the much bigger picture.